Once again, it's Friday. My name is Tommy Palmer. I am the youth pastor at Rockford Lane Baptist Church, and it's that time of week again where we'll start to roll out sermons for Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and we just pray and we hope that these sermons and these videos and recordings have been a blessing to you during this crazy time of quarantine and self-isolation for some. But today I'm going to teach or preach a sermon called The Invitation, and it's actually coming from two passages in Scripture. First one is Matthew 22, 1 through 14. The second one is Luke 14, 15 through 24. Both passages contain what's called a parable, and it's Jesus speaking these parables to a crowd. And we'll dive into exactly what a parable is and why Jesus used them and whatnot. But first, I want to read the passages, and then we'll go on from there. So Matthew 22, 1 through 14. Once more, Jesus spoke to them in parables. The kingdom of God is like a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent out his servant to summon those invited to the banquet, but they didn't want to come. Again, he sent out other servants and said, "Tell those who are invited, see, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and fattened cattle have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet." But they paid no attention and went away, one to his own farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his servants, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged, and he sent out his troops, killed those murderers, and burned down their city. Then he told his servants, "The banquet is ready, but those who were invited were not worthy. Go then to where the roads exit the city, and invite everyone you find to the banquet." So those servants went out on the roads and gathered everyone they found, both evil and good. The wedding banquet was filled with guests. When the king came to see the guest, he saw a man there who was not dressed for a wedding. So he said to him, "Friend, how did you get in here without wedding clothes?" The man was speechless. Then the king told the attendants, "Tie him up hand and foot and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are invited, but few are chosen." So now the second passage is going to come from Luke 14, 15 through 24. For the most part, this is very similar to the passage in Matthew, but there is some differences. But let me read that, and then we'll kind of, like I said, we'll start to interact with why are there differences and all of that good stuff. So Luke 14, 15 through 24. When one of those who reclined at the table with him heard these things, he said to him, "Blessed is the one who will eat bread in the kingdom of God." Then he told him, a man was giving a larger banquet and invited many. At that time of the banquet, he sent his servant to tell those who were invited, "Come, because everything is now ready." But without exception, they all began to make excuses. The first one said to him, "I have bought a field, and I must go and see it. I ask you to excuse me." Another said, "I have bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I'm going to try them out. I ask you to excuse me." And another said, "I just got married, and therefore I am unable to come." So the servant came back and reported these things to his master. Then in anger, the master of the house told his servant, "Go out quickly into the streets and the alleys of the cities, and bring in here the poor, maimed, blind, and lame." "Master," the servant said, "what you have ordered has been done, and there's still room." Then the master told his servant, "Go out into the highways and hedges and make them come in, so that my house may be filled. For I tell you, not one of those who were invited will enjoy my banquet." So we saw there two accounts of Jesus telling a parable, very similar parables. But first, let's discuss what is a parable and why did Jesus use them. parable, it's a word that you hear often in church. You might not have known what it is, or you might not be able to really, articulate exactly what is a parable. I know if you ask me, I'll probably scratch my head like this, and I'll be like, give me a minute. It probably would take me a few minutes to try to figure out exactly, how to describe what a parable is. Well, I decided to, be like the good millennial that I am, and I did a Google search, and here is what Google says in regards to what is a parable. It says, a parable is a simple story used to illustrate a moral or spiritual lesson. And then I love this last part. It said, as told by Jesus in the Gospels. Well, parables were around before Jesus. It's just, we just know them because of the Bible and because of Jesus. But it was actually very common for people to use parables in his time. But let's now focus just on the Gospels. Let's just really focus on the first three of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Luke. I had trouble fumbling around on what order they are. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And let's look about how many parables they are, and let's see exactly how common how commonly Jesus used parables. And then, so in Matthew contains actually 23 parables, and 11 of those are unique. And what I mean by unique is that they are parables that are not found in any other gospel. So these parables, the 11 unique parables, you can only find them in Matthew. Mark, the shortest, obviously has the least amount of parables, and and Mark contains 8 with 2 unique parables. And then Luke is actually the gospel who has the most, with 24 parables and 18 unique parables. So if you combine them all together, we have actually 31, distinct, unique parables between the first 3 gospels of the Bible. Now, you might be asking, well, what about John? Well, John didn't really record parables. John was more worried about leading up to kind of proving why Jesus was the Son of God, and he lays out his gospels with the signs, the first sign of like water turning into wine and all of that stuff. And he didn't really focus a lot on Jesus using parables. So with that being said, let's kind of go back and kind of, I like to just point out that since the definition is that it's a simple story, I just like to point out that we should not take these stories as literal and historical accounts. Now, I say this, and yes, Jesus probably, Jesus did say these parables. There's no doubt about that. But the actual parables themselves did not actually happen in real life. They're just simple stories to teach a lesson. And we actually have something very familiar to us within, our Western modern culture, and we like to call them fables. If you don't know fables, you probably have told fables, fables, but fables are just short stories with moral teaching, and there's 2 of them that kind of, came to my mind right off the top of my head. And the first one is the goose that lays the golden eggs, and the boy who, the little boy who cried wolf. So the goose with the golden eggs, the story. It's a goose that lays golden eggs. The owner, gets greedy, starts selling the eggs, and then he's like, oh, I want to keep all this to myself. I want to keep all the wealth to myself, and ends up killing the goose. And the moral of the story is that, greed is a dangerous thing. And then, of course, with the little boy who cried wolf, there was a little boy in a village where a wolf is a very big deal because it can attack people. Well, he decides, hey, I'm going to say that I seen a wolf and make everybody go into panic. Well, the first few times the villagers believe him, but then when the actual time that he actually does see a wolf, the villagers do not believe him, and he gets eaten. Moral of the story is that lying is a bad thing, and that people will stop believing you if you lie too much. But we don't hold those stories as real. We don't actually believe there was a goose that laid a golden egg, and we don't believe that there was an actual village with a little boy who said, oh, there's a wolf, and nobody believed him, and then he died. Now, honestly, that one could have probably actually have happened, but there's no pinpoint in history where we're like, yeah, that was actually Johnny from the tribe of whatever. And I don't think a tribe would have Johnny as a common name, but that's just me. It's just what I come up with off the top of my head. So why am I making a big deal over parables? And I just like to point this, I'm making this big deal because I like to point out that within the Bible uses different genres. And what I mean by genres is just like styles of writing and styles of communicating. Okay, the Bible is made up of 66 books, but it's not all written by one author. Yes, it is all written by one author if you're thinking in the sense that God wrote the Bible. Absolutely true. But God decided to use human authors to write down what he wanted. And he gave them freedom. He gave them the freedom to choose what words they wanted, what style of writing they wanted to do. And as a result, we have the different genres. And there is a big portion of it that is historical narrative, like the Gospels and a good part of the Old Testament. But you don't read Psalms. So if you think of Psalms in the Old Testament, we instinctively do not read those the same because we know they're poetry and they, exaggerate stuff. We don't read them quite like we would, Genesis or Exodus. Like when we read Exodus and we read Moses, parting the sea, we say, oh, okay, we know by the way this style of writing and what's going on that this is reporting history. But when we come to the Psalms, then we know, oh, it's figurative language. Jesus would have done the same thing. As a human being, we do not always talk literally. We use, expressions of speech, figures of speech. There we go. We use figures of speech. We use exaggerations. And if you ever know those people that tells you those fish stories, I've caught a fish this big, most of the time they're exaggerating. They don't actually catch a fish that big. But we know that's just part of the speech. That's just part of, they're just trying to express that it was a really big fish, even though they're exaggerating exactly how big that fish is. But if we forget that, and if we want to try to come to the Bible as that everything is literal, well, then we miss a point, and we're going to be in some dangerous situations. And here's the one, or an example, that it will get you really into a tight bubble. And it's when Jesus tells his disciples, hey, if your eye causes you to sin, God, take it out, pluck it out. Or if your arm causes you to sin, cut it off. Now, I don't know anybody who, just instinctively is like, okay, and then it's like, oh, my hand caused me to sin, give me an axe and let me chop it off. I don't know anybody that does that. Everybody who reads that passage just instinctively knows, hey, Jesus is just using hyperbole, and he's actually talking about going to radical means to, cut sin out of your life. Now, that does not mean cutting off your hands and plucking out your eyes, but it means, changing things and, getting rid of things that can cause you to sin. So so Jesus even used figures of speech. He used different styles of speaking to his disciples. But why parables? Why use parables so much? And this is really, I had to really think about this for a little bit. It's like, why would Jesus use parables? And it just kind of dawned on me, so, well, duh, short stories, people just remember them better. People, they just naturally get those stories. When I was thinking about, the goose that laid the golden egg and the little boy who cried wolf, I didn't have to really remember those. They just came to mind. It's like, oh yeah, I remember those stories. And I haven't heard those stories in probably 15, 20 years, maybe. So these parables, these short stories with lessons, they stick to us more. And it sticks to us more than it will stick to people more than just like a long lecture. So sometimes Jesus did teach in long lengths to his disciples. But have you noticed, even with us today, when we think about the teachings of Jesus, what sticks out to us more? Sometimes, a lot of times, it's those parables he tells, like the Good Samaritan. Everybody knows that, but that was a parable. It was not a literal, historical event. So, with all that being said, now let's address why are there differences between these two parables. And the first thing is that the first thing I'd like to point out, Jesus more than likely reused parables for different teaching situations. Jesus was a traveling teacher. He had to repeat lessons very often because, if he went to Galilee or he went to Jerusalem, I'm trying to think of somebody somewhere else, if he went to Jerusalem and he taught, but then, he went to Damascus, well, the people in Damascus don't know what he taught in Jerusalem. There is no YouTube, there is no telephones, there is no, TV or radio. So if he wanted to teach them something similar to what he did in Jerusalem, well, he would have to repeat his lesson. And actually, he could actually tweak it to be more appropriate for his audience. And then in this case, this is what seems like Jesus is doing. Jesus is using the same parable, but he's kind of tweaking it to the audience a little better. And this is why I say this, because in Matthew, when you look at it, when you kind of look at the verses and the chapters around Matthew, we quickly learn that this parable that Jesus speaks actually happens during Holy Week. It happens in the last week of Jesus' life. And he's teaching this to a group of people within the temple complex. So he's teaching it to people who would just been there to worship, been there to make sacrifices, but he's also teaching it to the elders and the chief priest. Now, when we get it to Luke, things change. His audience changes. And actually, the parable, the timing of this parable actually happens well before the Holy Week, well before he, does his triumphant entry into Jerusalem. He's actually sitting, it seems like he, was invited by a Pharisee for a meal and he decides to go. And this is when this parable takes place. So while, yes, they're two different parables in a sense, they have slight nuances, but I would say, well, not two different parables, they're two different versions, and I would say that they're the same parable. Jesus is just tweaking it to kind of fit the, the situation better, to kind of, better articulate to his audience. So with all that being said, let's quickly just let's recap that parable, because I've been talking about what is a parable and why did Jesus use them. And so let's quickly just freshen our minds of what happens in the parable. And I'll be mostly looking at Luke's parable. You can go back and reread Matthew's if you want, but I'll be primarily focusing on Luke's account. So we have a master of the house who decides, hey, I am going to, throw a big party. I'm going to get a big get-together. And I'm going to invite all these people. So he, sends out ahead of time, hey, I'm having a banquet. I will let you know when it is ready. So, because he's got to spend time getting everything ready. He's got to spend time getting the animal slaughtered and cooked and all that stuff. So it comes to time when he says, okay, everything is ready. Go tell everybody who's invited that they can now come. But as we read, they start making excuses. And they're not really good excuses. And this is why I say, let's look at the excuses they give. The first one says he bought a field and he must go look at it. In your mind, why would somebody buy a field without looking at it? That is like the equivalent today of you buying a car without looking at it. You're just saying, hey, I need to buy a car. And somebody's like, hey, I am selling a car. I'll give it to you for, X amount of dollars. And you're like, oh, okay. And you hand over the money and all that stuff. And then you find out the car is a piece of junk. It doesn't run, or it needs a lot of work. And you're like, well, hey, I just got screwed out of, a bunch of money. That's why we do not buy stuff before we see it. And then in Jesus' day, if you are a farmer, if your livelihood depended on a good field that is able to, produce a lot of crops, why would you just buy a field just randomly without going to see it first? Any smart business person or any smart buyer would be like, hey, I want to check this field out first. And that kind of falls through with the second guy too. The second guy made the excuse that he bought oxen and he wanted to go try them out. Once again, if you are a farmer and you are dependent on growing things, why are you buying oxen before checking them out? They might not be able to do the task. They might not be able to they might not be strong enough to pull the farming equipment. So why buy such a big, such a large number of oxen without even knowing them, without even looking at them first? And then we get to the last person. The last person is a newlywed, and he's like, I can't come. I just got married. Well, in that day, what kind of, newlywed couple would not want to go to a social gathering? Why would you not want to go to a party? You're a newlywed couple. You're like, yeah, let's go out. Let's go talk to our friends. Let's go see people we haven't seen in a while, and just catch up with people. Why would a newlywed couple not want to do that? So the servant comes back and says, hey, I told everybody it's ready, and they gave me excuse after excuse after excuse. So the master is like, okay, well, now go out and find the people that society looked down on. And, he told them, let me actually get back up to the Luke passage here. He said, go out quickly into the streets and alleys of the cities and bring in here the poor, maimed, blind, and lame. So the people who, who aren't rich, the people who can't sing, the people who can't even walk. I want those people in my house for this celebration. And it's really, this is really a time where they would have looked down on these people, and they would have seen them as like cursed or smitten by God. It's like, well, God's not blessing you, and that's why you are living this life. Now, and then before we go on, I'd just like to point out, it is very interesting in Matthew's account that there is somebody in a wedding who is not dressed for a wedding, and so the master has them tied and thrown outside. And then honestly, I'll just kind of go expand on that now, and that's pointing out that there are people who are able to sneak into this banquet who wasn't actually invited, and we'll kind of unpack that here in a minute. So what is the meaning of this parable? Why is Jesus telling this parable? And really, we'll kind of, let's just walk through it. So the one hosting the banquet is obviously God. He is now ready to bring these people into the celebration, to have fellowship with these people. He has spent time preparing, and now it's like, all right, now is time. It is now time to come and celebrate. So what is he celebrating? He's celebrating the fact that he is sending his son, that the Messiah has come, and now people can come and gather, and now they can actually enjoy fellowship with their God. So if you think about it, who are the people invited? Well, it's Israel. The host is God, and God has spent this whole time in the Old Testament getting ready for this, banquet, to get ready to throw the celebration of redeeming his people. But when the time comes, the people who are invited start making excuses. And they make excuse after excuse after excuse. The Pharisees, most likely, made the excuse that, they didn't want to give up their power. They didn't want to give up their money. They didn't want to give up their status. And they were so entrenched into religion, not religion, but more like they were so entrenched into their traditions and their kind of added on man-made laws that when Jesus came around and started challenging them, it didn't set well with them. It's like, well, we know what the law says. We know how to live our life. Who are you to come along and tell us we are wrong? So it's like, you're not the Messiah. The Messiah wouldn't come and try to tear down our way of life. And then for other people, they did not picture Jesus to come as a carpenter's son who would eventually die on the cross. They wanted somebody who would come, who would build up a military, and who would rebel against Rome. Now, why would they want that? Well, for hundreds and hundreds of years up until this point, Israel has not been a free nation. They haven't been a free nation for generations. It's been one nation after another. A nation came in, it's conquered them, and then a nation came in and conquered that nation, so they were under somebody else. But this generation has never experienced true freedom. They've always been under somebody, and at this point of Jesus' time, they are under Roman power. And they get tired of it. It's like, man, we're getting tired of paying these taxes. We're getting tired of having to deal with, Rome trying to push this idol worship onto us and trying to make us worship Caesar. So they get in mind and say, wait a minute, we had this Messiah coming that's going to make everything right. And then they were like, oh, this is what the Messiah is going to be like. He is going to liberate us from, Roman power, which wasn't the case. Obviously, it was not the case. The scriptures never pointed to that reality, but they believed it. So that was their excuse. Their excuse for not accepting Jesus was that you are not who we think you are supposed to be. So as a result of everybody making these excuses, God then opens his, invitation to his banquet to those that the Jews, would not expect. And who are those people? Well, it's the Gentiles, so it's people who are not Jewish. And then, even worse for the Jews, it's the Samaritans. And Samaritans were so despised by the Jews because they were half Gentile and half Jewish. They were, I don't mean this in a mean way, but I mean, they were like the mutts of their days. Like, they were just mixed in as a half breed. And it's like, well, we don't like the Gentiles, but we really don't like these Samaritans. And there's also other reasons. The Samaritans altered the religious text, and that kind of caused a lot of problems as well. But the Jews despised the Samaritans so much to where if, they were going from point A to point B and the quickest route was through Samaria, they would actually go around Samaria to try to avoid those people. That's how much they did not like them. So now this invitation to this banquet now goes out to those people. And that's what the whole meaning of that parable is that the original people that was supposed to take on this salvation and take on this new relationship with God, they are not worthy. They rejected it. But because of their rejection, now the gospel is starting to be spread to those other people that they looked down on, the people that they deemed not worthy of the gospel. And so what does that mean for us today? And I'd just like to give, just a couple of points here, and then I will be done. This is not going to be a 40-minute lesson like the last two videos I have done for these Friday sermons. The first one is that the gospel invitation goes out to everyone. And so if we're still using that, language and imagery of a banquet, and that God is throwing his banquet and invites everybody to come and join him and have fellowship with him, well, that invitation goes out to everyone now. It's not just to a select few. It's not just to those who, have it all figured out. It goes out to everyone. And this would include those people who are not like us and who we, kind of look down on too. And I'm not saying everybody who listens to this video or hears this recording looks down on people, but I've noticed a lot of times, especially within a church setting, we sometimes kind of play favorites with people. And it's more, and we're just naturally drawn to people who look like us, who talk like us, who act like us. So when somebody comes in and we're not used to their lifestyle, then we kind of push back and we're like, well, why are they here? And there is some churches, if you don't go in there on a Sunday morning with a suit and a tie and looking all groomed, being all groomed and trimmed and proper, they will look down on you and just be like, why are you here? Don't come back until, you clean up yourself. And that's not what the gospel is. The gospel is this gospel invitation goes out to everybody, not just people that we think it should go out to. So that means for a church, when you have somebody coming in, who smells like smoke, who smells like alcohol, who, might look like a biker, just looks up there, looks like they're from the rougher part of town, we do not, and we should not just look down on them and be like, why are you here? We should be glad that those people are here. No matter who walks through a church door, we should be glad they are there, because they can hear the gospel. They can hear about what Jesus has done for them, and then they can become a part of the family of God. Second application, so the first application is that the gospel invitation goes out to everyone. The second application is that accepting God's invitation comes at a great cost. And I kind of skipped this originally, but we'll kind of address it now. Accepting this gospel invitation does actually indeed come at a great cost. And I like Luke's account, because right after the parable of the large banquet, he picks up, and a lot of people will know this section, because it's the part that says, that Jesus says, whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. That's immediately following this parable, and there's a reason why Luke puts it there. But let me read that whole passage from verse 25 to verse 27. It says, now great crowds were traveling with him, so he turned and said to them, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. And this is immediately following the parable of the large banquet. So Luke is using this as a way of saying, yes, if you accept this invitation, if you want to go to this banquet, if you want to become a part of God's family, it's going to come at a cost. You got to put God above everything else in your life. And that sometimes creates chaos. That sometimes that makes you choose and make hard decisions about your job or your family or whatnot. And then it can kind of make, people on the outside that are looking in on you to be like, why are you doing this? Why didn't you take that job promotion? Why did you not, want to go to the bar with us last night? So following Jesus and becoming a part of God's family means we actually give up something. But whatever we give up, it is not worth, it's not worth it to just cling on to those things that we don't want to give up and spend an eternity separated from God. So that is what we need to keep our mind on as if we, share this gospel invitation with others. We need to keep in mind this is going to be a great cost. And is there anything in our life that we are trying to cling on to? Is there anything in our life that we're like, no, we don't want to give up? And that kind of, gets in the way of following Christ. That gets in the way of picking up our cross. And it just reminds me of the rich young ruler, that when, Jesus tells him, go and sell all your possessions. And he goes away sad because he accumulated a lot of wealth and he did not want to give up everything. Jesus might not tell us to give up everything, but he is going to tell us to give up stuff that we care about and that we treasure. And if we want to be part of that banquet, we need to give that up. If we're not, then we're going to be like that person who's in Matthew's account that kind of sneaks in, who says, yeah, we're Christian. Yeah, we belong here. But then on the day of judgment, we're going to be thrown out to the outer darkness where there's gnashing of teeth. And that's awesome. And Jesus uses that numerous times to describe hell. So all of that meaning that we need to take serious this gospel invitation. If you are a Christian and you have been a Christian, you've already accepted this invitation, you have already said, yes, I want to be a part of this banquet, then self-examine yourself and see if you are, if you are paying that high cost to be a part of God's family. So let me just pray, and then we will be done with this sermon. And I pray that you will go listen to Rick and Ken's message as they become available later this weekend. Dear Lord, just thank you for this day. Just thank you for the sermon, Lord. And I pray that we will not take lightly our responsibility to spread this gospel invitation to everybody, regardless of how they look, of how they talk, of how they, act. I just pray that we will be on fire to go out and tell people about Jesus and what he has done for us, Lord. And I just pray that we just be united to fulfill that great commission that Jesus gave us in Matthew 28, Lord. I pray all this in your son's name. Amen.